The forest was silent, smothered under a blanket of snow so thick it swallowed every sound. The only thing that broke the quiet was the distant rumble, the low, rhythmic growl of engines that didn't belong there. It was December 1944, and the Ardennes was supposed to be calm, a place where soldiers could breathe for a moment. But what no one knew was that beneath that frozen stillness, the last great gamble of Nazi Germany was about to erupt. In the early morning haze, black silhouettes emerged from the mist. Tanks, massive, cold beasts painted with frost, crawling through the forest like predators. Inside one of them sat a man named Joachim Paper, an SS commander whose reputation was built on fire and fear. His orders were clear: drive through the American lines, take the fuel, and open a road straight to Antwerp. It was madness disguised as strategy. The German High Command believed they could split the Allied forces in half and force a peace treaty before the war ended. But belief was all they had left. For the first few hours, it worked. The Allies were blindsided. Communications shattered. American troops, young, under-equipped, and frozen to the bone, scattered in panic. Convoys burned on icy roads as German armor thundered forward. It felt like 1940 again, lightning war, swift and ruthless. Yet this time, the lightning struck from a dying storm. Then came the first hook, the kind of twist history loves to hide in its quiet corners. Paper's advance stalled not because of enemy fire, but because of fuel. His tanks were hungry, their steel hearts beating slower with every mile. The Germans had designed a perfect assault but forgotten one thing. War, at its core, runs not on courage or commands, but on logistics. Every shell fired, every mile traveled, every battle won or lost depended on gallons of gasoline. As the sun climbed over the white hills, Paper's column stumbled upon an American depot near a small Belgian village named Hansfeld. There, in the middle of nowhere, stood Salvation, rows of fuel drums, shimmering like treasure in the frost. It was more than luck. It was a miracle, the kind of discovery that could turn defeat into momentum. Soldiers cheered as they refueled, filling their tanks and trucks. For a moment, the war seemed winnable again. But miracles, in war, often have expiration dates. By the time Paper's men moved again, the Americans had regrouped. Reinforcements poured in from every direction. The once vulnerable Ardennes became a trap of snow and smoke. Allied bombers circled above like vultures, and the roads turned into graveyards of steel. Paper's tanks began to burn one after another, not from lack of will, but from lack of fuel. He was no longer advancing toward Antwerp. He was retreating toward oblivion. And here lies the second hook, the cruel irony of it all. The Germans, who had once conquered half of Europe, were now losing because they couldn't move their own machines. Their soldiers fought like ghosts of a vanished empire, their bravery overshadowed by the mechanical rhythm of American industry. The United States was producing thousands of planes, tanks, and trucks each week, a tempo no nation could match. While the Germans scavenged for every drop, the Americans were drowning in abundance. By Christmas, the white silence of the Ardennes was filled with the sound of collapse. The German advance had bent but never broken the Allied front. What Hitler had called the Ardennes offensive was now being buried under mountains of snow and numbers. Over 100,000 men would die, freeze, or disappear in that forest, but the war itself had already chosen its winner. And here comes the third hook, not a battle cry, but a realization. Modern war isn't fought with swords or speeches. It's fought in factories, on assembly lines, in the steady rhythm of engines that never stop. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't the last stand of Germany's army. It was the final proof that in the age of machines, courage without capacity is just another form of surrender. As Paper stood watching the last of his tanks burn in the snow, he must have known. Somewhere deep down, under the smoke and ice, he realized this wasn't about bravery anymore. This was about scale, the power to build faster, move farther, and endure longer. And that's the fourth hook, the haunting truth that echoed long after the guns went silent. Germany didn't lose because it ran out of soldiers. It lost because it ran out of fuel. The snow was no longer white. Days of fire had turned it gray, soaked with oil and blood. The forests that once hid the German tanks now hid their wrecks, twisted iron beasts frozen mid-roar. The Ardennes had become a graveyard not just for men, but for ambition itself. And at its center, Joachim Paper stood staring into the ruin of his own advance, surrounded by silence that spoke louder than orders ever could. When the attack began, Berlin had promised him glory, the last counterstrike, the blow that would turn the tide of war. But promises in wartime fade faster than gunfire. Now, his men were scattered, their vehicles abandoned, and their fuel tanks dry. What was once a bold thrust toward Antwerp had become a desperate retreat through a wasteland of snow and smoke. The first hook emerges here, the kind of cruel twist that defines the nature of war. The Battle of the Bulge was supposed to prove that Germany still had strength left, that the Reich could still bite. Instead, it proved something far more terrifying. Even the fiercest armies die when the machine stops moving. The mighty panzers, once symbols of unstoppable power, were now nothing but frozen statues of defeat. Paper's unit, the infamous Kampfgruppe Paper, had cut through American lines like a blade at first. But that blade dulled with every kilometer. His soldiers began to strip captured jeeps for fuel, melt snow for water, and scavenge rations from the dead. The Germans weren't advancing anymore. They were surviving. Every decision became a gamble. Burn the last drop of gasoline to move forward or stay and freeze to death. And then came the second hook, one that history rarely tells with empathy. Among Paper's men were boys barely 20, trembling not from fear, but from the cold that turned breath into mist and skin into stone. They had been told they were the saviors of the fatherland, but what they really were remnants of a dream collapsing in real time. The world they were fighting for no longer existed. Behind them, cities lay in ruins. Above them, Allied planes owned the skies. Ahead of them, there was only more snow. Meanwhile, far beyond the frozen front lines, the American industrial machine was humming like an unstoppable engine. Thousands of miles away, in factories from Detroit to Pittsburgh, workers, men and women alike, worked around the clock. Every wrench turned, every bolt tightened, every gallon shipped was another weapon forged in a war that wasn't just fought with bullets, but with production. This was the third hook, the silent battle, the one that decided everything before soldiers ever saw combat. The Americans didn't just fight the Germans, they outbuilt them. By the end of 1944, the U.S. was producing over 2,000 aircraft every month. Entire fleets of tanks rolled off assembly lines while convoys carried endless supplies across the Atlantic. For every gallon Paper's men found, America produced 10,000 more. In the snow-covered villages of Belgium, the contrast was stark. German troops burned houses just to stay warm. American troops built field kitchens and handed out coffee. One army was living minute by minute, the other was thinking months ahead. The gap wasn't just technological, it was psychological. Germany was fighting a war of desperation. The Allies were fighting a war of inevitability. By New Year's Eve, Paper's once proud column was gone. His tanks were abandoned, his men scattered, his name now whispered in stories that mixed fear with pity. The German high command called for him to hold out. But what was there left to hold? He had no fuel, no food, no way forward. The Ardennes had swallowed him whole. And that's where the fourth hook tightens, the haunting reflection that in every war, the real killer isn't the bullet or the bomb, it's time. Time erodes hope, drains fuel, and devours courage. Paper's final stand wasn't written in reports. It was etched into the snow by footprints that led nowhere. As dawn broke over the silent forest, the air was filled with the faint hum of Allied engines, a sound that meant more than victory. It meant continuity, capacity, and power. The world was changing, and those who couldn't keep pace were destined to vanish. The Battle of the Bulge had ended not with a bang, but with a slow, grinding realization. Germany's war machine had stopped breathing. The fog hung low over the Ardennes, heavy and unmoving, as if the sky itself refused to watch what was happening below. In the distance, faint echoes of artillery rolled through the valleys, fading like dying thunder. The Great Offensive, Hitler's final gamble, had collapsed under its own weight. The dream of a resurgent Reich had frozen to death among the shattered trees and burned-out tanks. But history doesn't just end with defeat. It lingers, whispering lessons through the smoke of what's been lost. Paper and his remaining men stumbled through the snow, their boots crunching over ice that hid bodies beneath. The once proud SS commander had no more vehicles, no more fuel, and no more illusions. The road that was supposed to lead to Antwerp now led only backward, toward survival. The men carried their weapons, but even they knew the war had already slipped through their fingers. Germany was bleeding from every direction, and no amount of discipline could stop the hemorrhage. Here comes the first hook, the realization that shattered the myth of invincibility. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the German soldier as unstoppable, forged from iron and fire. But in the Ardennes, iron froze and fire died. The reality was far less heroic. Exhausted soldiers fighting hunger, cold, and the crushing weight of inevitability. The world had changed, and Germany's machines of war were relics in a new industrial age that they could no longer sustain. Behind enemy lines, American supply convoys roared like lifelines through the frost. Fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and medical jeeps streamed across the landscape with precision that seemed almost mechanical. Every soldier on the front line could count on food, warmth, and backup. The U.S. Army wasn't just fighting with men, it was fighting with momentum. Its greatest weapon wasn't courage, it was continuity. That leads to the second hook, the contrast that defined modern warfare. On one side stood an empire that had mastered tactics. On the other, a nation that had mastered production. Germany's blitzkrieg had been designed for short wars, swift victories, and limited resources. But this was not that kind of war anymore. This was a war of endurance, and endurance favored the one who could keep the engines running. As Paper's men trudged through the frozen woods, they could hear the distant hum of Allied aircraft, a sound that meant death, but also truth. The Allies owned the skies, the seas, and now, even the rhythm of time itself. For every German soldier hiding beneath the trees, there were 10 American bombers circling above. Each one was a reminder that technology, when multiplied by willpower and wealth, becomes something unstoppable. The third hook rises here, the haunting echo of a shift that changed warfare forever. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't just a fight for land, it was a fight for the future. It proved that wars were no longer won by the side that fought the hardest, but by the side that could afford to keep fighting. The factories of Detroit, Chicago, and New York were the true front lines, miles away from the snow but dictating every inch of it. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the high command refused to face the truth. Maps were redrawn, orders were issued, and promises of victory continued to echo in marble halls already trembling with fear. The generals still believed that if they just pushed harder, fate would bend. But out in the Ardennes, men like Paper knew fate was already sealed. His radios were dead, his supplies gone. His men, starving, frostbitten, and haunted, looked to him not for orders, but for answers. And that's where the fourth hook grips, the human tragedy within the machine. Beneath every tank number and troop count were lives, young and old, trapped in a war that no longer made sense. They weren't fighting for ideology anymore. They were fighting because they had no choice. The silence of the Ardennes wasn't just the sound of defeat. It was the echo of humanity drowned by its own creation. Already sealed. His radios were dead. His supplies gone. His men, starving, frostbitten, and haunted, looked to him not for orders, but for answers. And that's where the fourth hook grips, the human tragedy within the machine. Beneath every tank number and troop count were lives, young and old, trapped in a war that no longer made sense. They weren't fighting for ideology anymore. They were fighting because they had no choice. The silence of the Ardennes wasn't just the sound of defeat. It was the echo of humanity drowned by its own creation. When Paper finally ordered his men to scatter, it wasn't surrender, it was acknowledgement. The fuel had run out, the guns were silent, and the dream of conquest had frozen in the Belgian snow. The last engine sputtered, coughed, and died, and with it, the last heartbeat of Germany's ambition. The forest grew quiet once again. The snow began to fall, soft and unassuming, covering everything. The tanks, the tracks, the dead, as if nature itself was erasing the memory of what mankind had done. The war had taken on a strange kind of quiet. Not peace, never peace, but a hollow stillness that only comes after something immense has broken. The Ardennes, once the stage for Germany's boldest counterattack, now lay buried under the weight of its own failure. Trees stood blackened by explosions, their branches heavy with frozen smoke. And somewhere beneath that lifeless silence, thousands of dreams, of glory, of survival, of home, were frozen too. Joachim Paper, stripped of his steel monsters and command aura, was now just another man trudging through snow. His breath came out in clouds, his steps heavy, his eyes hollow. The SS insignia on his uniform no longer inspired fear. It was a curse, marking him as part of an empire that had run out of time. Around him, a handful of soldiers stumbled through the ruins of their own legend. Men who had once believed the world could be conquered with iron and fire. Now, they only wanted to live through the night. The first hook hits here. The realization that the German war machine, so feared and admired, wasn't destroyed by superior strategy. It was strangled by reality. The Allies didn't outfight them, they outlasted them. The factories of America had become their real army, and no general could command against production lines that never slept. The Germans had built an empire on speed and shock, but you can't blitzkrieg your way through exhaustion. As Paper's men wandered through villages reduced to ash, they saw the price of their nation's arrogance written in every burning wall. Civilians stared in silence as soldiers passed, their eyes filled not with hatred but pity. The once invincible Wehrmacht had become a caravan of ghosts, and behind every step, they could feel the invisible weight of engines they no longer possessed, tanks they could not fuel, planes they could not fly, and dreams they could not sustain. Then comes the second hook, the cruel paradox of war. Germany's downfall wasn't born in the battlefield, it was born in the boardrooms and assembly lines years earlier. While the Reich built symbols of dominance, massive tanks, intricate weapons, complex machines, the Allies built quantities. Simplicity, mass, repetition, these became weapons more powerful than any panzer division. America didn't need to match German engineering, it only needed to outproduce it. In London, Eisenhower received reports that the German offensive had stalled. In Washington, factories were already producing replacements for every vehicle lost. The speed at which America could rebuild was terrifying, a sign that this was no longer a human war, but a mechanical one. And mechanical wars don't forgive inefficiency. By January 1945, the snow began to melt, revealing not victory, but reckoning. The roads were lined with twisted metal, frozen corpses, and empty fuel drums. Each drum told the same story. Ambition without supply is suicide. Paper's unit, once 5,000 men strong, was reduced to a few hundred stragglers. The rest were dead, captured, or lost in the woods that had once been their hope. The third hook surfaces here, the haunting idea that technology, once mankind's greatest triumph, had become its cruelest executioner. The very machines built to make men invincible had turned them into slaves to maintenance, fuel, and logistics. The tank crews who once roared into battle now prayed not for victory, but for a gallon of gasoline. It was as if the war itself had chosen its god, and that god was industry. When Paper finally abandoned his last vehicles and ordered his men to scatter, the order was not shouted, it was whispered. There was nothing left to command. His soldiers disappeared into the trees, shedding insignias and weapons to avoid capture. The man who had once led armored columns across Europe now walked alone, with only silence marching beside him. And that's the fourth hook, the reflection that all empires die the same way, not in one grand explosion, but in the slow collapse of movement. The tanks stop rolling. The radios go silent. The fuel runs dry. And suddenly, history shifts its gaze elsewhere. As night fell over the Ardennes, snow began to cover the remnants once again, soft, cold, merciful. It hid the scars of tanks, the footprints of men, the evidence of failure. But beneath that snow lay a truth that would echo for generations. In modern warfare, courage may start the fight, but only capacity can finish it. Germany had gambled everything on one last strike, and lost not to the enemy's bullets, but to the rhythm of an engine that never stopped. The winter was beginning to ease, but the chill it left behind would last for generations. The Battle of the Bulge had ended, yet its echoes rolled across Europe like the aftershock of a dying giant. Villages that had been razed were now nothing more than outlines of smoke against gray skies. The forest stood as witness, silent, scarred, and ancient, as if nature itself refused to forget what had been done in its name. Paper had disappeared into that forest weeks earlier, a man once feared across continents. now reduced to a fugitive. His men scattered into the frost, hunted by Allied patrols and betrayed by exhaustion. For the German soldiers who survived, there was no glory left to cling to. The same snow that had once hidden their tanks now covered their graves. For the Allies, it was a victory, but one that carried a haunting reminder. They hadn't won because they were braver. They had won because their world could build faster, feed longer, and endure deeper. The first hook unfolds here, the realization that wars aren't decided on battlefields anymore. They are decided long before the first shot is fired, in factories, in policies, in the pulse of nations that can outlast chaos. Germany had believed in the supremacy of will. America had believed in the supremacy of production. And when will met production, steel met infinity. In the ruins of Bastogne, American soldiers built fires and shared rations, their laughter echoing through the ruins. They were young, some barely out of school, but behind them stood an empire of assembly lines, a nation that could replace every bullet fired and every vehicle lost. For them, the war was not an act of desperation but an exercise in inevitability. They were part of a system so vast, it turned survival into statistics and victory into arithmetic. Across the ruined villages, civilians began to emerge from cellars. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty. They had lived through a war that had turned their homeland into a chessboard of ideology and steel. To them, neither flag represented salvation, only endurance. The war that had promised liberation on one side and dominance on the other had left them with nothing but ashes. The second hook emerges here, the forgotten cost of victory. Behind every tank and plane, there was a price paid by those who had no say in strategy. Farmers who lost their fields, families who lost their homes, children who lost the idea of safety. The great powers would write history as numbers, but the forest knew the truth. Every advance was built on bones, every counterattack paved with frost and fear. By early February, Allied intelligence confirmed what was already clear: Germany's military machine was collapsing. Factories bombed beyond repair, railways shattered, oil reserves empty. What had once been the most advanced war machine on Earth was now gasping, coughing, dying. Every German city had become a target, every night sky a theater of flame. The Reich that once sought to rule the world now struggled to fuel a single tank. The third hook strikes here, the poetic irony of decline. The same technology that had given Germany its power became its downfall. Tanks that required perfection were useless in imperfection. Airplanes that needed precision collapsed in scarcity. The more advanced the machine, the more fragile the dream. While Germany built marvels, America built momentum, and momentum doesn't break. When the last remnants of Paper's group were captured, there was no defiance left in them. They were frostbitten, starving, and silent. For them, the war had ended long before the surrender. Their leader, once a symbol of strength, now stood as a testament to the futility of fighting against a force that doesn't tire, a civilization powered by steel and scale. And that brings the fourth hook, the final understanding that marked the modern age. War had evolved. No longer the clash of heroes and empires, it had become a system, cold, mechanical, mathematical. The victors were not those who charged bravely, but those who calculated better. The Battle of the Bulge was not Germany's defeat, it was humanity's turning point. It was the day war stopped being personal and became industrial. The Ardennes grew quiet again, as if the earth itself exhaled after holding its breath too long. Beneath the melting snow, twisted metal gleamed under the faint sun, relics of ambition buried in time. Above it all, the wind carried the faint echo of engines, distant yet eternal, reminding the world of one unchanging truth. Once war becomes a machine, men no longer control it, it controls them. By spring, the snow had melted into mud, and with it, the last illusions of German victory dissolved. The Ardennes, once thunderous with engines and fire, now lay drowned in silence. Fields that had shaken under the weight of tanks were carpeted with rust and wreckage. Birds had returned to the forest, nesting inside the hollow barrels of cannons that would never fire again. The war was not over yet, but its ending had already been written in the language of exhaustion. Joachim Paper was finally captured. The man who had once commanded steel divisions now walked into Allied custody with frostbitten hands and a 1,000-yard stare. There was no fight left in him, no defiance. Only the realization that he had been chasing a ghost. The Germany he had fought for no longer existed. Its cities were ashes, its leaders delusional, its soldiers scattered across the continent like broken promises. The first hook rises here, the haunting collapse of an empire that mistook intensity for endurance. Germany had waged a war of brilliance, but forgot that brilliance burns out. Its scientists, engineers, and strategists had created some of the most advanced weapons in history, but no nation can fight the laws of arithmetic. When every tank required 10 times the resources of its enemy, every victory became a countdown to defeat. Meanwhile, the American war machine had reached a scale the world had never seen before. Production never stopped, not for day, not for night, not for mercy. Ships rolled off assembly lines faster than U-boats could sink them. Planes filled the skies like steel locusts. For every German bomb that fell, 10 Allied bombs answered. The numbers told a story more brutal than any general's report. Germany was losing not by tactics, but by tempo. The second hook emerges here, the transformation of war from chaos into choreography. Every movement of the Allied front was backed by the rhythm of industry. The supply lines stretched like veins, pumping fuel and food with mechanical precision. War had become synchronized, predictable, efficient. It wasn't fought in moments of courage anymore, but in systems of continuity. Germany's chaos had met America's order, and order had won. In Berlin, whispers of despair began to echo through marble halls. Goebbels still spoke of victory. Hitler still issued orders to phantom armies that no longer existed. But outside those walls, the Reich was collapsing under the weight of reality. Trains no longer ran. Fuel depots were empty. Even communication lines were crumbling. The mighty machine of domination had turned on itself, its gears grinding into dust. The third hook deepens here, the moral decay that follows mechanical failure. As resources vanished, ideology grew crueler. The Nazi leadership demanded loyalty from soldiers who had nothing left to give, executing those who surrendered and blaming fate for what they had engineered. What had begun as a vision of supremacy now devolved into madness, the last act of a regime that couldn't admit its own defeat. Back in the Ardennes, American soldiers began the slow, methodical process of recovery. They buried their dead, repaired their roads, and salvaged what they could from the ruins. Among the wreckage, they found diaries, letters, and photos, reminders that the enemy had faces, families, and fears. For many, the discovery brought no triumph, only reflection. They had survived the costliest battle of the Western Front, but survival did not feel like victory. And that leads to the fourth hook, the sobering truth of what victory means in total war. The Allies had proven that strength comes not from destruction, but from endurance. Yet in proving it, they had built a machine that would outlive the war itself. The same factories that had fueled liberation would soon fuel competition, marking the dawn of a new era, one where peace would still sound like engines. As night settled over Europe, the fires dimmed, leaving only the faint hum of distant machinery. War had changed the world, not through ideology, but through innovation. The Ardennes, once a battlefield, had become a museum of metal and memory. Every rusted tank and frozen rifle whispered the same message. Power without sustainability is only noise before silence. And as Paper sat in his cell, staring through iron bars at a sky finally free of bombers, he understood the truth he had once ignored. Courage can start a war, but only continuity decides who survives it. The world now stood at the edge of silence. Cities once filled with laughter had become ghostly ruins, and the skies that once echoed with roaring engines now held only the whisper of wind over twisted steel. Yet in that eerie stillness, humanity's most fragile spark, hope, refused to die. Soldiers who had lost everything still looked to the horizon, wondering if the rising sun would finally bring peace or just another dawn of chaos. The war had reshaped every heart, every nation, every dream, leaving scars that would outlive generations. In the last days of the conflict, as the dust of collapsed empires settled, the victors were not celebrating, they were mourning. Triumph had never felt so hollow. For what was victory, when the price was millions of souls and centuries of trust turned to ash? The leaders signed treaties in rooms filled with tension and grief, their pens trembling not from power, but from the weight of guilt. The silence in those halls was deafening, an unspoken truth that this war had no true winners, only survivors. Across the ruined cities, people began to rebuild. Rubble was cleared, homes were patched, and children who had once cried in bomb shelters now played in the same streets, unaware of the ghosts walking beside them. The war had taken fathers, mothers, and entire legacies, but humanity's strange resilience emerged again. Each brick laid, each field replanted, was an act of defiance, a quiet promise that the world would not be defined by destruction alone. Still, beneath the smiles, everyone carried the same question: could this peace really last? As the global order shifted, alliances crumbled, and new powers rose from the ashes, the lessons of war were already fading. Governments spoke of progress, technology, and a better tomorrow, but behind closed doors, factories resumed the hum of production, not for rebuilding homes, but for building better weapons. Nations smiled across conference tables while spies whispered in corridors. It was as if the world had learned nothing, only rephrased its madness. The scars of war were healing, but deep underneath, the infection remained alive. There were those, however, who refused to let history repeat itself. Survivors turned storytellers, soldiers turned poets, and civilians turned activists, all sharing their stories so the next generation would understand what truly happens when humanity loses control. They spoke not of glory, but of grief, not of conquest, but of cost. And through their voices, the truth began to echo louder than any propaganda ever could. Still, the world listened only for a while, until comfort replaced conscience once again. Years later, as monuments rose in the memory of the fallen, a strange irony unfolded. People came to take pictures, not to remember. They smiled in front of statues built from pain, forgetting that each engraved name represented a life that once breathed, laughed, and dreamed. The world had turned tragedy into tourism, and somewhere in the distance, an old veteran watched quietly, realizing that remembrance without understanding was just another form of forgetting. The war had ended, but its shadows stretched far beyond the battlefield. Borders redrawn by politics tore apart cultures that once coexisted. Ideologies clashed under the guise of peacekeeping. The illusion of unity blinded nations to the quiet build-up of a new kind of warfare, one fought not with bullets, but with influence, misinformation, and greed. Humanity had changed the battlefield, not its nature. The world was at peace, but peace itself had become fragile, a thin thread ready to snap at the next spark. And so, as the century turned, history whispered its warning once again. The faces were new, the weapons different, but the story was hauntingly familiar. Power would rise, fear would spread, and nations would play the same deadly game under a different name. The silence after the last war wasn't the sound of peace. It was the breath before the next storm. Because war doesn't end when the guns stop firing. It lingers in minds, in memories, and in every decision made by those who survived it. It hides in the pride of leaders, the ignorance of citizens, and the ambition of those who believe they can control chaos. And one day, when the world grows too comfortable again, the echoes of history will awaken. The lesson was simple, yet forgotten every time. War doesn't create heroes, it creates ghosts. And if humanity continues to chase power instead of peace, those ghosts will return, marching through time, reminding us once more what it truly means to lose everything.